In songs whose lyrics have captured the attention and imagination of millions of people worldwide, the pattern is this. The first 2 to 4 lines, and usually it's actually the very first line of the song, tells us what the problem is that is driving the entire song, which is to say, those first lines tell us what the conflict or tension is that is troubling the heart and mind of the songwriter, compelling them to do what feels to us as listeners like bursting in the song in order to deal with and grapple with and work through that tension, problem, or conflict. Let me show you some examples of this immediately so you know exactly what I mean.
The problem is all inside your head, she said to me.
La da 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 da, here I go again with another love song that I wasted. Just another love.
I know you think that I shouldn't still love you. I'll tell you that.
The Dido example is actually one of my favorites from this list of examples because it contains a whole world of human drama in less than 10 words. So from this line alone, we know the following. Firstly, there was a relationship in the past. Secondly, it broke down. We know the protagonist is still pining and possibly even haranguing the other character. We know the antagonist is annoyed about it. And we also know that the protagonist knows that the antagonist is annoyed. And all of that in less than 10 words. So much drama, so much conflict. As human beings, we are glued to that sort of stuff. And we need to know what happens next or what happened to get us up to this point where there's all this conflict and convoluted tension and problem troubling the heart of the songwriter. Let's look at some other examples just because it's so much fun.
Love of mine, someday you will die, but I'll be close.
I can hear my neighbors making love upstairs. Their love is rattling my... So be it, I'm your crowbar. If that's what I am so far.
Walk grace, desperately hating his old place, dream to discover a new...
Hopefully you can see in all of these examples that it's the first line that sets up the problem, tension, or conflict that is driving the need to sing this song. The songwriters aren't waiting to the chorus. They're not waiting for the second verse. They're not gently setting things up for us. We know immediately what the crisis is at the heart of the song. The crucial thing to understand here is that not all lines of lyric are built the same. They're not all equally as important as each other. It turns out that some lines are more important than others because of their place in the structure of a lyric. Those lines have spotlights shining on them, or as my lyric writing teacher when I was at music school called them, he called them power positions. The power positions in any song are the first line of any section and the last line of any section. It's as simple as that. Now, we can create power positions or we can create artificial spotlights by doing unexpected things, right? By setting up a pattern and then actually subverting the expectation created by that pattern. But at a basic level, the first line and the last line of any section. But the first line of the song is the first line of the song, right? It is one of the most important lines in the whole song. So here is one very important lyric writing tip for me to give you. You are no longer allowed in your songwriting life to use a generality or a cliche in your first line. You can use them elsewhere in the song as long as they're balanced with other rich, interesting language, but not in the first line. So if we take this idea that our first line or our first 2 lines, or maybe if we're being really relaxed about it, our first 4 lines, really need to set up tension, We can also now start to dive into different types of tension that we can create, different types of tension that are going to immediately grab the heart and mind and ear of your listeners and make your lyric irresistible. They just, because of the drama that you're creating immediately, they need to know more. The first is what I call image tension. And this is where we use a vivid sensory image. We're painting a vivid, rich picture with that first line, but it's not mere description. Something has to be happening. There has to be something action-based. There has to be an interesting verb or something happening inside that image. That's what gives it a sense of movement and a sense of tension. Let me give you some examples.
Oh, the night came undone like a party dress.
Now, this is a beautiful line because it's a great image. There's no cliche there. You've never heard that line before. You've never seen that image described like that before. So immediately that's compelling. But also there's something happening. The night is coming undone, which is just a beautiful image. And then using the metaphor of like a party dress is so powerful, so unique, such a great image.
Walking round the room singing stormy weather at 50.
Picture perfect memories scattered all around the floor.
Outside another yellow moon has punched a hole in the nighttime, yes.
Each of these examples splashes a multi-sensory scene in the canvas of the mind, but notice that each of them contains an active verb. Something is happening because movement implies change, and change is really the spark that creates connection and emotional connection between a storyteller and an audience. So that's the first way that we can create tension immediately, is using a vivid image, but where something is happening, something is in motion. Our next level of tension is called inner tension. And as we work through these levels of tension, these are becoming more and more intense. So the level of tension is increasing and becoming more sticky and more irresistible for a listener. So what is inner tension? Inner tension is really directly introducing the protagonist, which is to say the voice of the song, the main character of the song, whether you're singing from an I perspective, a first person perspective, or you might be singing in the third person, right? Like that John Mayer example, Walt Grace. That's a song entirely in the third person. It's all about Walt Grace. It's not about John Mayer or some John Mayer persona being sung from the first person perspective. It's a third person narrative. So whether it's first person, third person, second person, it doesn't matter. In that first line, if we are clear on what the tension is inside that character's heart or mind, a listener is immediately drawn in. So try this in your next song. Try putting your main character in the first line and put them in a state of action, conflict, or tension. Inner tension can also be a matter of wanting something else or something more than what you have. Look how the following example sets up a really intense feeling of longing.
Looking out on the morning rain, I used to feel so uninspired.
If you are someone who loves musical theatre or you write songs in the musical theatre domain, one thing that you might be familiar with is the concept that in musical theatre there's almost always, for the main character, the I want song. And so this is a type of song in musical theatre that is sort of part of the musical theatre trope or conventions of musical theatre, that we really clearly need to know about our main character. What is it that they want or need or desire most in the world? And so the I want song in musical theatre is so important to the whole narrative. But we can see that this idea of setting up that fundamental want, need, or desire by framing it as wanting something more or something else than what one currently has or had is a really powerful way to set a song in action. And again, it's irresistible for a listener. Which brings us to our third level of tension, interpersonal tension. By far, the most compelling and intense type of conflict is conflict between two people. And this really is the molten core of human drama, right? You walk down the street and you see two people arguing. You can't really help but want to slow down and know what they're arguing about, even if you happen to be polite enough to resist that urge. Interpersonal tension can sometimes be outright conflict or argument, but it doesn't have to be. It can also be a growing sense of distance between two people, or a feeling of lost connection, or misunderstanding or miscommunication. So let's have a look at a couple of examples.
Those flowers that you bought, well, they should have been for me. It's getting me.
It's not a silly little moment. It's not the stone they fall that come. This is the deep.
Hopefully you can see from these three levels of tension, image tension, inner tension, and interpersonal tension, that creating conflict or revealing the essential problem at the heart of the song almost straight away, if not in the first line, is one of the most powerful ways to grab a listener and draw them irresistibly into the world of your song. I'm interested to know whether you have observed this, whether you think about it, whether it's something you talk about, and how you think about those first few lines and the importance of the first few lines of the song.
It's such a great topic because we can think of this like a meeting. You're meeting the songwriter. That's how I always think about, that first lyric for me is, this is the first conversation I get to have with you, those first phrases. So that idea of first impressions really comes into play. And the way the songwriter phrases that first line, the tone, the intent, all of those things, I think you're quite sensitive to because you haven't eased into the song yet. You haven't heard anything else. This is that first impression. And so we talk about this a lot in class, especially looking at things that aren't songs, especially looking at like literature and poems, because I think the great thing about looking at literature is authors, they're a special kind of breed. They spend so long agonizing over the right choice of words. They spend so much time just writing. They don't spend time worrying about chord progressions. They don't spend time worrying about music theory. The written word is their craft, and that is what they spend all their time obsessing over. So one of the things that I've done in class previously is looked at the great opening lines in classic literature and just played around with it to see what kind of impact it makes. I think impact is the main thing we're looking for. What is that feeling and that impact the moment you hear that opening line? And so there's some great examples we can look at from some classic literature if you want to
Show us.
So one of the great ones I just love starting with is from Albert Camus, 1942, The Outsider.
Do you mean Albert Camus?
Albert?
Camus! You're not allowed to say Camus anymore. It's Camus!
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
Is it? Really? I'm such a Luddite. I'm such an ignoramus. Opening line, mother died today. Or maybe yesterday. I can't be sure. And I love that. And I think the reason I love it is because it's a bit morose. It's a bit dark, straight up. And it's kind of, I think also the really interesting thing when you're looking at first lines of literature is checking in with yourself to check why you glitched. To find out what it was that kind of got you going, hang on a second, because we sort of stop and go, hang on a second. And I think the interesting thing about this one is, mother died today or maybe yesterday. And you're like, how can you not know? That's the first thing you think, how can you not know? It's your mother, And so you become enraged and incensed at this narrator or this character being so vague about the details of something as serious as his mother dying. And I just think that's genius to grab our attention and to get us feeling all of these emotions within 5 seconds.
It reminds me of a lyric writing exercise, which is basically called 6-word stories. And it's the idea that it's basically like in 10 minutes, try and write as many 6-word stories as you can. And it's based on this story about Ernest Hemingway. Have you heard about this?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
For
so
sale. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. For that. So it's the Ernest Hemingway story that goes something like, Ernest Hemingway was meeting his drinking buddies at the pub in the Florida Keys, and he walked in looking even more morose than he normally would, even more bedraggled, and his writing buddies were like, Ernest, what's wrong? And Ernest Hemingway, renowned for economy of language and trying to say things in the most simple, direct way you possibly can, unornamented, language, came in and slammed down this ripped out piece of newspaper and said, today I read the most beautiful story I've ever read. It's terrible. And his buddy said, what do you mean? Where did you read it? And he said, it's even worse than you think it is. I read it in the classified sections of the local newspaper. And they said, what are you even talking about? And he said, and it's even worse than that. It's only 6 words long. And his buddy said, you can't be serious. I don't know what you finally lost it, Ernest.
Yeah.
And he said, no, let me read it to you, and unraveled this piece of newspaper and read it out loud. And those 6 words were, baby shoes for sale, never worn.
Although I remember it, and we'll have to check this, because for sale, baby shoes, never worn is the order I remember, because
there you go. Well, either way that it works, right, it's like 6 words packs a punch, and it tells a story, and it raises all these questions and conflicts, and immediately, your brain starts creating the story of what happened to this baby. Why were there baby shoes? Why were they never worn? What are the circumstances in which these parents were having to sell the baby shoes? So you run this lyric writing exercise. It's like, all right, I want you to come up with as many 6-word stories as you can in 10 minutes, and part of that is about how do you build drama and tension and conflict and mystery, but mystery with an implication of story, into 6 words or less. And I love that exercise because it is all about economy of language. And, as songwriters, we are in the business of economy of language. I often say to my students, we have to, on very limited real estate, build mansions in the minds of our listeners. And we need to know how to do as much as we can with as few words as possible.
Totally. And what the 6-word story shows us is that you can take people on a complete emotional journey in very few words. There is an intro to that 6-word story, and then there is a little bit of detail in the middle, and then there is the turn, the twist. And that's amazing to think that you don't need more than 6 words to take someone through that kind of emotional roller coaster. Just like mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I can't be sure. I've now got about 12 questions that I need to ask this character, to get that kind of buy-in and that kind of investment from the reader or the listener. That's the game, I think, to get that investment and that involvement straight away. George Orwell, 1984. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. And again, the word that always comes to mind here is the glitch. I feel like the device that's being used here is it's creating a glitch in us. Everything's going along fine. Bright, cold day in April, nothing wrong there. But the clocks were striking 13 has been deliberately placed because we know clocks don't go up to 13, certainly not in our world. So what kind of world is this where clocks do strike 13? It feels like they took a lot of care with that opening line. It feels like they weren't being lazy and saying, yeah, we'll get to the great part after about 25 pages. It feels like they really thought about, how am I going to engage you with the very first sentence? How am I going to show you that I care, that you care about this story that I'm about to tell you? And so that's like the glitch effect. I think there's also some great openings where they're just setting tone. I think, they're giving you a feel for what kind of ride we're in for. And a great one there is Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And the opening of that is the story so far. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move. And so I love the fact that in there, he's got social commentary. He's got just dry humor. He's got this kind of grandness to the idea of the whole universe being created and that being kind of a mistake. It's so tongue in cheek. And to pack all of that tone and all of that humor into that first line and pull it off, again, I think is just a great device.
Interestingly, bridging these examples that you're giving directly into lyric writing, it's interesting. From the 3 examples, the second one with the clock struck 13, that line sounds like a line of lyric to me.
Yeah,
and I think that it's actually because it's the economy of language. It actually creates that glitch, like creates that kind of tension between one thing and another, or that like juxtaposition between two seemingly, incongruous ideas or images, like very quickly. Whereas that example, I'm like, okay, let me just pretend for a second that that's a lyric. Well, the first 3 lines are all pretty generic. Do you know what I mean? It's like we have to wait until the last line to get the punchline. And I think one of the things that is different, or that we need to like translate as songwriters, is we have less time. We have less real estate. We can't even like take that amount of time. But of course we can take the concept of that and try and apply it, to our own writing. But again, to me, that like creating that glitch has to happen faster.
Absolutely. And what happens, I think, when you see great songwriters do it, is you get that combination of like a little glitch plus tone being set very quickly. So Paul Simon with Sounds of Silence, hello darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk to you again. There's a moodiness to it, and there's a darkness to it, and there's a real tone being set, but it also creates this little glitch where there's a conversation that's not with another person. It's a conversation with something else, and it creates this nebulous kind of ambiguity. So I think you're right. It has to be, if that first line is going to be punchy, we have to borrow the techniques from these great these literary giants, but then get to the point much quicker. Yeah. I love Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, just for so many reasons. But, the opening of that, and it's a crazy ride, but we were somewhere around Barstow on the edge of the desert when the drugs began to take hold.
That sounds like a lyric, doesn't it?
That's a lyric.
It's like, it's rhythmic too.
Totally. We were somewhere around the edge of Barstow on the edge of the desert when the drugs began to take hold. So 2 things. It's a little setting. This idea of the deserts, so they're remote. The drugs began to take hold basically says to me, buckle up. That's Hunter S. Thompson saying, fasten your seatbelts. And, the songwriting equivalent for me, the one that I always think of, is Hotel California. On a dark desert highway, cool wind in my hair, smell of colitas rising up through the air. It's that kind of, we're going to put you in a little scene. We're going to give you a little sense-bound imagery, that kind of immersion, and then we're going to twist it later on. But that putting us there straight away, I think, is such a big part of it, setting that tone. Okay, so Cap, I got a question for you.
Okay.
And it's a question that I'm sure you've been asked many, many times, and I've certainly been asked many, many times. We've just been analyzing this language and talking about the techniques that are being used and all these different devices. Do you think, and I'm being cheeky here, but this is the question that gets asked to us a lot. Do you think these writers meant it deliberately to do all the things we've just been pointing to and talking about?
Like, did they deliberately know what they were doing?
Did they deliberately know what they were doing?
I get this question all the time, and it's not just about lyric writing. It's also about like chord choice or about melodic technique, in classes where we're sort of showing these tools or techniques or methods or processes or, it's like aspects of craft, The question always arises, but did that songwriter really know what they were doing? And I'm glad you asked that question, Benny, because I've got some answers.
Okay, I bet you do.
So my smart ass answer to this question is, I don't know, and I don't care. It doesn't matter to me at all whether or not they did or didn't know, because that doesn't change the impact of what they did do. It doesn't change my ability or my capacity to look at something, ask myself, what is happening here, right? What effect is happening on me emotionally or in terms of my level of engagement, and how is that person achieving that effect? And if I can figure that out, it doesn't matter at all whether or not they meant to do it or not meant to do it, right? And one of the examples I think of is like, if we were in a photography class and a photography teacher showed you an Ansel Adams photograph and said, look at the contrast of light and dark. Now, if you want to achieve the same contrast, what you need to do on your camera, right, is increase the aperture and decrease the shutter speed. And look, I'll show you. This is how it works. Click. See? No one in that photography class is going to say, yes, but did Ansel Adams mean Did he know to put his aperture there and his shutter speed there? Because the answer is, it doesn't matter whether he knew. It doesn't matter whether he was really going, okay, I need to set this at 2.4. Okay, I need to set my shutter speed. You know, it doesn't matter. Or if really what was happening for him was he was just reaching for a feeling and, you know, adjusting the variables until he landed on the thing that he was feeling, right? Like, it doesn't really matter how he arrived at it. What matters for us is that we can figure out, and much more quickly, if we want to achieve the same effect, achieve that effect. You know, so my kind of smart ass answer is a little bit like, doesn't matter at all. Like, the question is kind of asking the wrong question. The real answer to this question, my more like sensitive answer to this question, is a bit philosophical and a bit kind of psychological, which is to say, what is knowledge? You know, because the question sort of assumes that knowledge is only explicit or deliberate or conscious, that we only know something if we can tell you what we did and how we did it and why we did it, right? Like, that there's explicit knowledge. But it turns out that that's not the only type of knowledge that there is. There's also implicit knowledge. And implicit knowledge, which we also colloquially call intuition or instinct, is knowledge. It's not different, right? And Malcolm Gladwell wrote about this at length in the book Blink, right? That these kind of intuitive responses that experts have, and here I'm not talking about naive intuition, I'm not talking about childlike, or, you know what I mean? I'm talking about people who are experts in their craft, or like great songwriters in this case, right? Like, even if their experience of doing that thing was intuitive, they still knew what they were doing. It was just implicit knowledge. It was knowledge gained through experience, through practice, through deep listening, through deep analysis to other songwriters, or like that Ansel Adams, you know, example. They were reaching for a feeling, right? They might have been going, the song at this moment needs more tension, right? But rather than experimenting with the 390 available chords, right, and just randomly picking one out of a bag, they have knowledge and experience to know which subset of chords are actually going to result in the effect that they're trying to reach for, right? And even if they're not consciously flicking through, like, okay, A minor, 7, sharp 9, no, A, right? Even if they're not consciously doing that, they might be at the speed of lightning, it seems, trying certain things out and quickly arriving at the right feeling, right? But that's knowledge. It's not that that's not knowledge. It's just knowledge by a different name. You know, so just because someone is doing something intuitively, firstly, doesn't mean they don't actually know what they're doing, right? And that's what muscle memory is. Muscle memory is moving something from conscious or explicit knowledge into implicit or intuitive knowledge. Doesn't mean they didn't know what they were doing. And also for us as songwriters, curious enough to try and learn from other songs and get better at songwriting by learning from better songwriters, it doesn't really matter whether or not that knowledge was implicit or explicit.
I think it's really interesting to think about where the question comes from. You know, why does the question get asked so often? And I think it comes from a place of, I think it comes from two places. One, do I have to really do all this work? Do I have to do all this analytical work to get somewhere? But it also comes from this place of somehow analysis might tarnish the creative process. It might take away the magic. And
exactly.
And
is it counter creative to apply craft to creative process? Is
it going to deaden my creative flow or whatever? And I always think of it, you know, Bob Dylan basically analyzed Woody Guthrie right down to his shoelaces. Like he was so obsessed with Woody Guthrie. And so by the time it, you know, comes along for Bob to write his own stuff, this idea of intuition, I think really the word intuition is almost a problem. I think what intuition is, having absorbed the craft so thoroughly that you are now no longer deliberately thinking of the craft in the act of creating. So if you are thinking about your technical craft or any kind of technique whilst trying to express a creative idea, there's a problem, you know, and you have to go through that process. When I was learning to solo and improvise, it's like, yeah, I broke down the notes. I'm going to start on the flat 7. I'm going to go down to the 5th. I'm going to hit the flat 3. And then, you know, I had to do that to try and work out where my notes were in relation to my tonic. And really get a grip on it. But 5 years later, if I'm still thinking like that while I'm taking a solo, instead of just trying to say something elegant as a phrase, then I'm letting technique run the show. And so my answer to that question is always, yes, they absolutely meant it by not considering it deliberately. Instead, they've absorbed their technique so well that they are now in a position to simply express a creative idea and rely or trust on all the work they've done previously.
Yeah. And you know what? That reminds me a lot of something that John Mayer told me in 2008. And I was sort of recently rereading this like journal entry I made at the time, and have like reposted it on the like blog site, which I'll post a link to. And one of the things that he firstly said is he really was very encouraging about the acquisition of knowledge and skill, and really comes from a position of like, more is more, you know, like the more tools you have available to you, the richer your writing is, the more possibilities you have, the more things you can reach for, the more rich and varied your writing will be. But by the same token, you also have to know when to let go of that. And also you have to know why you are applying a technique, right? That's actually in the service of the song. You don't just want to be doing something because you can. You know, that's the thing. It's like you acquire this knowledge and this skill, but that doesn't mean that you should be packing it all into the one song. You know, it's all got to be there in service of the song, the idea, the emotion, and you know, if you're like a lyric-based songwriter, like the lyric, you know, has to be a relationship to the choices, musical choices you make in relationship to the lyric. But you know, that said, we're talking about inverse. Here I'm saying we can actually learn technique from great lyric writers, and it's not, you know, being a great lyric writer is not just about being the deepest, most tormented genius with the most like insight into the human soul. Like that's not actually what makes a great songwriter. It's actually knowing how to express something, and that how has a lot to do with understanding the ordering of ideas, the combination of showing and telling. It has to do with understanding the types of language that connect with and create communication with other people.
And I think you raise a really good point there, where, you know, I've never heard a great songwriter or a great musician or a great sports person for that matter who hasn't been obsessed with their heroes, like growing up, and didn't obsess over the details of the way their heroes did it. Just because you can't articulate that obsession or you can't articulate the process doesn't mean there's not a process there. I think words can be really clumsy in articulating, especially a creative process. What it was like to first think about the concept or learn about the idea, break it down in a way where we then have to find a way to communicate it, you know, find a way to translate it and then have the conversation. Yeah, great topic, Kat. Love it.
Good examples.
Thanks. Happy writing, everyone.
Thank you. We'll see you guys soon.
Bye.